PI and SAFE briefing on this report, which you all should have. It's also available on secureenergy.org, and it's a joint project between Securing America's Future Energy and Redeeming Global Economics. Just want to give a quick announcement. Our Congressional Scholar Program, we're currently accepting applications. So applications are due May 1st. If you're a Hill staffer interested in foreign policy defense, please check it out. There are flyers outside. And with that, I'm just going to turn it over to Chris Griffin, Executive Director of the Foreign Policy Initiative, to introduce our speakers and to kick off the briefing. Thanks so much for coming.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Christopher Griffin. I'm the Executive Director of the Foreign Policy Initiative. Until January this year, I had the pleasure of being one of your colleagues. I work for Senator Joe Lieberman here on the Hill, and it's been a great 90 days so far at FBI. The principal reason FBI is such a great place to work is because much of what we do is oriented around finding the great work that our colleagues are doing in the think tank community and working to deliver it to you. And this report, produced collaboratively by SAFE and Redeeming Global Economics, is a key example of that. And to give a 10-second summary, that we find ourselves in a convergence of opportunity where there may still be time to influence Iranian decision-making on its nuclear program, and the global economic climate, so far as the oil market is concerned, gives us an opportunity to try and do that. We'll introduce our speakers in the order in which they will speak, bouncing back and forth to my right and left. On my far right is John Hannah, who's a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and amongst the various high points of his previous career as National Security Advisor to Vice President Dick Cheney. After John sets out the scenario facing us as we try to think about the Iran problem, Paul Domjan, who is Managing Director at Redeeming Global Economics, will speak to his analysis of how the oil market should influence our thinking about the prospects of any new sanctions that could be imposed on Iran. And finally, Mark Dubowitz, who's the Executive Director of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, will speak to the specific options that members of Congress and their staff should be thinking about while they look at Iran today. John, if you could please start.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris, and thanks to SAFE and to FBI for organizing today's event and inviting me to participate. It's a great pleasure to be here, both with Paul, with whom I helped draft the report, and with Mark, who is a colleague at FDD, but also, if you don't know, one of the real heroes, I think, certainly outside the U.S. government, when it comes to the whole issue of sanctions and the effort to find a way of resolving this crisis over the Iranian nuclear program short of war. In the few minutes I've got, let me quickly make several points that I think maybe can help frame the discussion a little bit and put the report into a broader framework. First is simply to remind everyone of just how short the timeline is that we're operating on when it comes to the issue of stopping Iran's nuclear program. This, of course, is far from an exact science, but I think it's fair to say that there is a growing consensus that the sand is running out of the hourglass on Iran's nuclear program. President Obama himself suggested in March that Iran might be a year or so away from being able to produce a nuclear weapon. A very good report that everybody ought to read if they haven't already, that Mark Dubowitz helped put together, along with, I think, several of the most highly regarded non-proliferation experts in Washington, indicated that as things stand now, we probably have until about June of 2014. It's only 14 months before Iran achieves critical capability or essentially a breakout capacity, the ability to make a very rapid dash for a bomb, perhaps even within a few days, that the world would be unable to detect before it was, in essence, too late. Just this past week, Amos Yadlin, who is the highly respected former head of Israeli military intelligence, made headlines when he seemed to indicate that critical Israeli red lines concerning Iran's nuclear progress will almost certainly begin to be crossed sometime this summer, making some kind of military confrontation highly official in charge of the IAEA's Iranian inspections program, Ali Hainonen, who in an op-ed last month explicitly mentioned August 2014 as a point when Iran's nuclear potential will certainly be much stronger, and when Iran could be, at least that was suggestion, in a position to move toward breakout. And in an interesting twist and spin, based on his own long experience working in this convoluted international bureaucracy, Hainonen suggested that even if the IAEA, in the course of its regular inspections in Iran, which happen on a frequent basis, maybe once every week to 2 weeks, that even if the IAEA was able to catch the Iranians red-handed in the act of making a real push for a bomb, it would still probably take several weeks of briefings and reports in New York and Vienna and other places before the Security Council, the UN Security Council, actually would be able to wind itself up and take any meaningful action to condemn the Iranians. In other words, more than enough time for Iran to build a bomb before the U.S. had the kind of international backing it would ideally want prior to launching any kind of military attack. But at the end of the day, whether it's 4 months or 14 months, the bottom line is that we are getting perilously close to losing this race with Iran's nuclear program. If the preferred U.S. strategy of negotiations and escalating economic pressure is going to work by compelling Iran to change course and help us avoid a war that nobody wants, it has to work soon, and very soon. And I think that means that you need right now to be pulling out all the stops when it comes to sanctions in the effort to really cripple Iran's economy. This leads me to my second point. It's really a bit of a parenthetical point, a point of privilege on the history of this effort to stop the Iranian nuclear program, which is to say that until very recently, unfortunately, we haven't been pulling out all the stops when it comes to sanctions. The sad fact is that sanctions really have been a central element of U.S. strategy against Iran for at least a decade. And yet it was not until just last year, in 2012, that we finally began to target the real lifeblood of Iran's economy, which is the hard currency revenues that it earns from its large oil exports. And the overriding reason for that was the widespread, and I should hasten to add, I think quite legitimate, fear that people had that acting too aggressively against Iran's oil sales would disrupt global oil markets, resulting in a damaging price spike that would threaten both the U.S. and the world economy. I vividly recall my own experience at National Security Council meetings during the Bush administration as far back as 2007, when the Secretary of the Treasury nearly jumped out of his chair when the idea was raised of targeting oil transactions that involved Iran's central bank. After describing in quite apocalyptic terms the impact that such a move would have on the price of oil in the U.S. economy, it didn't take long for the whole idea of the central bank to be shelved. For me, that experience was really the poster child for the debilitating impact that America's dependence on oil has all too often had in our national security policy. The simple fact is that with respect to the Iranian nuclear program, almost without doubt, the most pressing threat that our country currently faces, our dependence on oil has had the effect of dangerously constraining our ability to pursue our national interests in their full scope. As Ali Hainonen, this IAEA inspector, has also noted, a decade ago, when we first really began this effort on Iranian sanctions, Iran's nuclear program was rudimentary. Had a few small-scale experiments on uranium enrichment and one very largely constructed enrichment facility. Today, Iran has 2 enrichment plants that are fully operational, including one that's buried deep under a mountain, increasingly impervious to at least conventional sorts of military attack. Iran has more than 16,000 centrifuges that have been installed or are spinning, which is a huge number. And now Iran is in the process of perhaps moving to a new generation of centrifuges, ones that will be capable of enriching uranium at 3 to 5 times more efficiently and it's currently the case, which further telescopes the timing for an Iranian bomb. Since President Bush first broached the idea of targeting Iran's central bank way back in 2007, just think, until the time that Congress acted in late 2011 and imposed these central bank sanctions, Iran gained almost 5 years of precious time during which it earned hundreds of billions of dollars in revenues from its oil sales, installed thousands of centrifuges, made huge strides in its nuclear program, and built up a stockpile of enriched uranium that, if further processed and enriched, would be enough for an arsenal right now of somewhere between probably 6 and 7 nuclear bombs. And as a result, this country, over time, that seeks to dominate the Middle East, hates America, and wants to wipe out the state of Israel, now stands on the precipice of becoming a nuclear weapon state. And that, I would argue, from that perspective, is a very real and very worrisome price that I think America has had to pay, in no small part, at least, because of our vulnerability on this question of oil. Now, going to this report, I think the importance of this report is that it suggests that in spite of our continued vulnerability to disruptions in the global oil market, a window of opportunity may now exist to target Iranian oil exports even more aggressively than we did last year, while largely averting the kind of ruinous price shocks that we feared in the past. As my colleagues will explain, Paul will explain, the window, in fact, opened very wide, I think, in 2012, started in 2012 as a result of various market conditions that emerged, including, I would say, the extraordinary boom in North American energy production, which allowed the U.S. and its allies to impose these series of sanctions, including the sanctions against Iran's central bank, including the European oil embargo and actions against reinsurance of Iranian oil shipments. That removed, last year, took upwards of 1 million barrels of Iranian crude off the market entirely, which battered Iran's economy, while we, on the other hand, suffered, I would say, minimal volatility in the actual price of oil. Nevertheless, out of an abundance of both economic and diplomatic caution, Washington was extremely generous in granting waivers to its sanctions, in effect greenlighting the continued purchase of very significant quantities of Iranian oil by a handful of countries. Most importantly, at the top of that list, I would say, are the Chinese. Now, what this report suggests is that the state of the oil market may be such in 2013 that if the U.S. and its allies wanted to crack down even further on Iranian oil exports, even going so far as to reduce them to zero, that's somewhere close to 1.5 million additional barrels per day taken off the market. We right now almost certainly have the running room in terms of the global oil markets to do so without causing a major price shock that would threaten our economy. The report correctly suggests that going down that route still carries a lot of risks that need to be taken into account, shouldn't be underestimated, and it recommends, I think, a series of very useful political, economic, and security moves that the U.S. and its partners should take to mitigate those risks and reassure markets, including a major diplomatic push with the Chinese to get their cooperation, to begin really reducing their purchases of Iranian oil, to the possible tapping of our strategic petroleum reserve, to preparations for preventing and signaling that we're ready to prevent, capable of preventing any Iranian attempt to close oil shipments through the Straits of Hormuz. Now, in this context, I have to mention the testimony the Secretary of State Kerry recently gave up here to the Congress. The Secretary, I think it was recently, last week, maybe 2 weeks ago, he was actually got pressed very directly on this need to get China to stop oil purchases from Iran. And his response brought back a flood of memories to me. He said that there's a point where these reductions become not only very difficult for a particular country to go beyond, but also where they have an impact on the global price. If you want the price to go up here in the United States, you can have the Chinese buying for more oil from somewhere else because they can't get it where they're getting it now from Iran. The Secretary then explained that if countries were pushed to make further cuts of Iranian oil, demand would push prices up, and you're going to see some price changes that may have everybody screaming as the summer comes. Well, again, it's deja vu all over again for me. Those are arguments that I've heard frequently over the last decade and certainly heard during my time in the Bush administration. But with all due respect, I would suggest that Secretary Kerry and his staff probably not read this report, because I think they've come to a different conclusion than they're at. And I'm glad to say that there were energy specialists like Ed Morse at Citibank who immediately came out to question the Secretary's assessment, noting that, in fact, I think echoing what this report makes very clear in its analysis, that there's plenty of oil around to cover further Iranian reductions, as well as the fact that there's an outstanding Saudi commitment that if any country needs incremental supply to make up for losses in Iran, the Saudis are prepared to provide it. And that no doubt goes for China as well, which is already a major purchaser of Saudi crude. So while there may be a lot of good reasons not to further curtail Iranian oil exports and instead try and go after their hard currency through other mechanisms, a fear that there will somehow be huge disruptions to global oil supplies, I don't think is a very good reason at all. In fact, I think it's probably fallacious based on what this report says. So the big question, of course, is whether going all out on Iran sanctions can work. It's clear that it hasn't succeeded so far. Yes, the Iranian economy has taken a major hit, the value of its currency has plummeted, and if our goal was simply making sure that the Iranian middle class couldn't afford to take vacations in Europe or buy a foreign car, we'd be doing wonderfully. But that's, of course, not our goal. We're trying to stop the nuclear program, and from that perspective, we're clearly losing, and the Iranian regime is winning. For all the pain that Iran's incurred over the course of, especially the last year, it was still allowed to take in something like $60 billion last year from oil sales. And while that's a far cry from the almost $100 billion that it earned in 2011, I'm told that 2012 still was the fourth best year in terms of Iranian earnings from oil. If sanctions are going to have any hope of changing this dynamic, where we're losing, the Iranians are winning in this race to a bomb, and if we're going to have any chance of averting a potentially disastrous military conflict, I think that we need to be capable of nothing less than convincing these very, very tough and hardened men that rule that regime in Tehran that if they don't relent on this question of their nuclear program, they will face outright economic collapse, and in fact puts their very survival of their regime at risk. Whether even that kind of effort can work in the end is, I fear, very much still in doubt. But if we're serious again about this policy, and we're determined to try and resolve this conflict short of war, which I think we have to be, then this is the direction that I think we need to move, and very quickly indeed, because as the report makes clear, the conditions for doing so, from the standpoint of the U.S. and global economy, are never likely to be as favorable than they are, as they are right now. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for that overview of the challenge and the significance of this report as you look at it. Paul would be grateful, as one of the lead architects of this report, the specific analysis that comes to those conclusions.
Thank you very much. So I'll try to speak a bit briefly, but hopefully say some useful things. So I come from a markets and economics perspective, so I have no view on what we need to do. But the national security colleagues here, like John and Mark, say, let's be even more optimistic. It's hard to be less optimistic. Let's be more optimistic than they are and say you've got 3 years. So if the challenge to us is, well, can you take much more, perhaps all of Iran's exports offline in the next 3 years, and when should you do it? You know, we can tell you when you can do that with the least impact on markets and how. And that's fundamentally what the theme of this report is. And I think I draw your attention particularly to pages 10 and 11, which focus on the how from the policy side. So the first thing to say is that the global oil market is actually super well supplied, much more so than it's been for a very long time. I'll give you just a couple of data points to anchor that. We have light tight oil production in the U.S. of roughly 2 million barrels a day, whereas we expected several years ago 0. Saudi has reduced its output from probably potential capacity at 11 million barrels all the way down to 9.2 because of lack of demand. And we see, so there's at least 1 million barrels, maybe 1.5 of additional output to come from Saudi Arabia. Libya has come back online strongly. And Iraq is coming online strongly and growing at, by the end of the year, we're expecting between 3.5 and 3.7 million barrels a day. So we have a very well supplied oil market. I mean, as we can say at the moment, we have something like 3 or 4 million barrels of spare capacity, which is we really haven't had since the beginning of the last decade for a sustained period of time. And that's pushing down prices. Since we wrote the first version report in March, oil prices have come down to about $20. And that's in response to the lack of demand. So if we look at the demand, so the supply side is very well supplied. At the same time, on the demand side, oil demand is remarkably weak. That's a combination of still a weak recovery in the United States, stalled growth in Europe, the beginning of slowing growth in China, implementation of fuel efficiency standards, all of that is pulling down demand. And we expect that to continue certainly through this year and to a lesser extent through next year, particularly as next year we expect the U.S. economic growth to pick back up and Europe to become at least a little bit less anemic. So what that means is you have a period of time today when you could easily take another 1.5 million barrels of oil off the market without disastrous consequences. Now, would prices be higher than they would otherwise have been? Yes. But we're talking about prices that are falling. So effectively, you can use the leverage in the current falling price to take more oil off the market, number one. And number two, oil is going to come off the market regardless because OPEC wants to target a price of $100 a barrel. And that means someone needs to take oil off the market. So by taking Iranian oil off the market, you're actually doing very much the same manipulation that OPEC would want to go through anyway. Indeed, we have a very robust debate inside OPEC about whether to impose a quota on Iraq, because this additional Iraq production is squeezing OPEC's ability to manage the price combined with very significant non-OPEC demand supply growth, particularly in the United States. So the first thing is there an opportunity this year to remove this oil from the market without serious consequences? The answer in our view is clearly yes. The second question is, well, how do you do that? And I think this is something that's not been sufficiently paid attention to, and this is why I particularly draw your attention to recommendations in this report. So, should you, from a national security standpoint, decide to adopt a policy of removing more Iranian oil from the market, the policy signaling is really important. If we look at the last round of sanctions last year, changes in the oil price were much more correlated with things like Google searches on Iran than they were with actual Iranian exports. So the market responded to sentiment, it didn't respond to supply, because actually it was well supplied. So the goal this year should be, if from a national security perspective, decide to go through another round of sanctions, to be very clear about what the policy tools are that will enable policymakers that show that number one, policymakers are aware of the seriousness of doing this, and that they have tools at their disposal to address that. And that, we believe, will very significantly help to avoid that sentiment, that impact of sentiment, and also keep prices low. And those are things like making it clear that we're prepared to utilize public stocks, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve here in the U.S., managing market logistics to make sure that Iran's customers remain well supplied from other sources, which is very doable. And Iranian crude isn't completely unique, certainly compared to the other Middle Eastern crudes that are coming upstream. Be clear about the geopolitical risks and how the U.S. can deal with them. So that's things like flagging U.S. flagged transitive carriers, securing the Straits of Hormuz, offering insurance, helping with insurance, ensuring that insurance is affordable through public guarantees. And being very clear about employing very clear communication throughout this process so that markets know what to expect. I mean, the worst thing that could happen here is to have a change that markets aren't ready for. On the other hand, if markets do know what to expect and we implement this change this year, and then demand starts to grow next year, that will be much less destabilizing than if demand's growing and Iranian crude is coming offline at the same time. I think it's worth for a minute dwelling on the example of Libya and replacing lost Libyan demand. So we've had a debate here in Washington, I guess I'm not here in Washington, but you in Washington have a debate about how much crude it's possible to replace. Is it 30%, is it 40%? Looking at this from an oil market perspective, it's very hard to understand where that debate is anchored, right? In the case of, so we're talking about 1.5 million barrels of oil a day, very similar to the Libya disruption, which happened in a much tighter market. And in the course of the Libya disruption, and actually Libyan crude is much harder to replace because it's going to older refineries in Europe that are less sophisticated that need light crudes, whereas Iranian crude is mostly going to Asia to very sophisticated refineries and would be replaced by similar quality crude. Even in this more complicated Libyan situation, right, the Saudis, led by the Saudis, were able to, the global oil market was able to adjust relatively smoothly. And you had a process of heavy crudes that were destined for Asia, light crudes that were destined for Asia being replaced by heavier crudes that the Asian refineries would still upgrade, diverting the light crudes into Europe, and the market remained supplied. So with the exception of Turkey, where you have some particular infrastructure issues around pipelines, it's hard to imagine that it's not possible to take Iranian exports basically to zero, certainly to take Iranian seaborne exports to zero, without serious consequences for Iran's customers. So that's I'd leave that with you, that I think there's this debate about the percentages maybe slightly out of line with what's possible in the market. Then I'd like to end with 2 points. The first is, as John mentioned, the revenue side has been really important. So the financial system matters as much as the oil markets. Leaving holes in the strength of the financial system sanctions certainly endangers the strength of the whole project. I think Mark will talk about gold as an example of that. But the other, where I'd really like to leave you off with from a market perspective, is to think about the counterfactual. So I think, we often have this debate of should we or should we not sanction Iran? And the counterfactual we're looking at is the world as it is without Iran sanctions. But, if John and Mark are right, and the counterfactual is the world with an Iranian nuclear device or the capability of one in a year and a half's time, right? That's much, much more destabilizing for the global oil market, not only now, but for the foreseeable future, than any kind of sanctions, particularly in this current very loose market. Right? In that scenario, you're talking about applying a risk premium, very significant risk premium, let's say $20 or $30 at least, which is basically a premium for war risk. All of Iran's exports, all of Iraq's exports, all of Kuwait's exports, probably all of Saudi Arabia's exports, for a significant period of time. So when I've made that point to people, they often will sometimes respond, well, it could be mutually assured destruction with the Israelis and nothing will happen. That's a very appealing narrative from a policy perspective, but in terms of the realities of how oil is traded, it really is not going to have not going to carry any weight. They'll immediately be a very significant risk premium applied, and that will be applied for a very long period of time. And so I think if you're making the argument that the U.S. can't afford the oil market consequences of taking a more robust policy towards Iran today, I think you also need to be able to explain how the U.S. will be able to afford the oil market consequences of nuclear Iran.
And Mark, informed by this analysis, could you lay out some of the options before Congress today and what the folks here should be thinking about?
Well, thanks, Chris, and thanks to you and to Robbie Diamond, the president of SAFE, and certainly great to be here, and especially with my 2 colleagues who've done a phenomenal job of laying out the national security piece of this, the oil market piece of this. Let me just begin, before jumping into the congressional opportunities here, with what I envision is, where I imagine is a conversation that takes place probably weekly in Tehran between Ali Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader, Abbas Davani, the head of Iran's nuclear program, and Mr. Bahmini, who's the head of Iran's central bank. And I don't know if this is taking place, but I imagine it should be taking place, where Mr. Khamenei brings in these 2 men on a weekly basis and asks some very simple questions. To Mr. Abbas Davani, how are we doing in terms of Iranian nuclear physics? What's the progress of our nuclear program? And John has touched on our assessment of that program. And the essential point there for Mr. Abbas Davani is he needs to get Iran to the point where they can have undetectable breakout, meaning that they can build a bomb without weapons inspectors or Western intelligence services detecting that breakout. They need to have a sneak-out option, where they potentially have a secret enrichment facility that is currently not under the inspections regime, where they can clearly produce a bomb of war's worth of weapons-grade uranium without anybody detecting it. They need a plutonium path, so they have the Iraq heavy water reactor, which gives them a plutonium path to the bomb, which has been one of the more popular ways in which countries have actually obtained nuclear weapons. And perhaps there is something going on in this Iran-North Korea relationship with the North Korean regime that is clearly a massive proliferator and also has to be one of the most difficult regimes to get intelligence on, as Clapper has testified to Congress about. So there's sort of 4 or 5 options for Iran and for Mr. Abbas Davani about how we can actually get to a nuclear weapon. We put a lot of emphasis on this undetectable breakout. I think it actually has some extraordinary opportunities for Iran to actually get to the point of a threshold nuclear power, not actually build a weapon, not take the risk of military strikes, but let the international community know they have an undetectable breakout and then call for massive sanctions relief, huge financial incentives in order to inhibit that breakout. So Mr. Abbas Dabani gives his report, and it's so far been a pretty good report. Mr. Supreme Leader, we're adding centrifuges and adding tons. We're adding advanced centrifuges. We're moving the point of critical capability. We're staying just under the Israeli red line, and we're going around the Israeli red line. And we are in a position where, Mr. Supreme Leader, we can hand you a number of different nuclear breakout, sneak-out options for your nuclear weapon. So that's nuclear physics. I imagine Mr. Khamenei then turns to Mr. Bahmini, who's a central banker, and he says, Mr. Bahmini, it's very important. We have enough money in the bank to help Mr. Abbas Dabani realize all the nuclear options. So how are we doing with respect to money in the bank? And he says, well, as your central bank governor, clearly what I'm talking about is foreign exchange reserves. And those foreign exchange reserves are essential for running the Iranian budget, for having the money to buy the goods, the capital equipment, the heavy machinery Iran needs to run its economy. And we need money also sitting in foreign bank accounts around the world that we can use for trade. And the essential point that I think Mr. Bahmini is telling Mr. Khamenei is, Mr. Supreme Leader, we're doing just fine. You know, these sanctions are hurting us. They have cut Iranian oil revenue by 40%, but this is our fourth best year in terms of Iranian oil sales. The Americans, those dastardly folks at the U.S. Treasury Department, are trying to basically capture all the oil revenue that we generate in these local accounts. They're locking them up in these escrow accounts in banks that are situated in countries that are buying Iranian oil. And they're forcing us to spend local currency in those countries, which is denying us the opportunity to get foreign exchange reserves. But we've got some interesting workarounds, and actually we are still buying the equipment we need from South Koreans and Japanese. We can get all the humanitarian goods we need from the Indian generic drug industry, from Japan's pharmaceutical industry. We're buying goods from China. So we're actually spending that local currency, and in spending that local currency, we don't have to spend the money in the bank. We don't have to spend our hard currency on all of those things. Right? So we're basically saving money in one account and spending it out of another. So Mr. Khamenei says, well, that's great news, but I'm still a little bit worried about the financial piece of this. I mean, if we run out of foreign exchange reserves before we reach undetectable breakout, then we have a serious problem. So I need to have enough money in the bank to get to that point. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to instruct Mr. Jalili, our negotiator, who's going to be going to Almaty to negotiate with P5+1. And I'm going to instruct him to hold out for sanctions relief. So now let's look at what Mr. Jalili did at Almaty 1 and Almaty 2. What Mr. Jalili did was he stood his ground. And he said, I will refuse to compromise on any nuclear concessions until you give us sanctions relief. So the first round of Almaty didn't end very well because the Americans, the French, called his bluff. We didn't offer him much. And he came back to Iran. He met with the central banker. He met with Mr. Supreme Leader. He said, look, I didn't get any sanctions relief. All right, well, you call up the Americans and the Europeans. You schedule another round, and I want massive sanctions relief. Almaty 2. So what did we do? Well, we showed up at Almaty 2, we the P5+1, and we offered massive sanctions relief. Does that come as a surprise to anybody in this room that we offered massive sanctions relief? Because it wasn't described that way in the New York Times. It was described as minor sanctions. Does anybody know what we offered them? In exchange for their 20% uranium, not all of it, but most of it, to stop 20% enrichment, and not to close Fordo, but to suspend it, what did we offer the Iranians in terms of sanctions relief? Anybody in Congress know? Don't feel bad, because no, people in Congress don't know. In fact, as you go around this town and you speak to folks, you find out that we actually don't know what we offered the Iranians at Almaty 2. Well, here's what we offered the Iranians at Almaty 2. We offered them the opportunity to sell their gold and their natural gas, which this year will be about $40 to $45 billion worth, in exchange for gold. Now, why is that important? Paul can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but That's important because if you're Mr. Mamini, the central bank governor, you need hard currency. You need dollars, you need euros. You can't get dollars because of U.S. financial sanctions. And if you're having problems accessing your euros, for a number of reasons we can discuss, the next best alternative is to get gold. How do we know the Iranians have been getting gold? Well, we know that there have been massive sales of gold from Turkey to Iran in 2012. A lot of that going through Dubai. Turkey has its own very important economic reasons why it needs gold and why it needs to sell gold. And Paul can talk to you about that. But the central point is we saw billions of dollars worth of gold going from Turkey, Dubai to Iran as Iran replenishes its foreign exchange reserves. And then you in Congress actually got wind of this. So you passed in the 2013 NDAA sanctions against the sale, transfer, or facilitation of gold. But the administration decided at Al-Mahdi to offer gold as a sanctions relief because the administration read the NDAA and realized that those gold sanctions are only operational as of July the 1st. So they had a 6-month window to basically offer massive gold sanctions relief. 6 months. Half of 40 billion is 20 billion, so $20 billion worth of gold to replenish Iran's foreign exchange reserves. And they knew they had until about July 1st to actually offer that sanction. So what did the Iranians do? When Mr. Jalili showed up at Almaty, they didn't reject the P5+1 proposal. They said, we'll study it. They went home and they continued their gold sales, gold purchases in this case. And nobody is sanctioning gold traders right now. The congressional legislation is only operational as of July 1st. The administration executive order from last June or July, which actually gives the administration the authority to sanction gold, is still at administration discretion. So they're not sanctioning anybody involved in the gold trade. So the Iranians are going to earn, at a minimum, 6 months worth of gold, about $20 billion, to replenish their foreign exchange reserves, and be in a position to give Mr. Khamenei and Mr. Abbas Davani the opportunity to reach nuclear breakout. Now, I'll end with this, and then we'll just talk about some congressional options. What happens on July 1st? How many people in this room think that the administration, with congressional pressure, are going to sanction players in Turkey and elsewhere who are helping the Iranians access gold? How many people think we're going to do that? None? I mean, it'll be U.S. law. Well, I agree with you. We're not going to do that for the following reason. What happens 2 weeks before July the 1st? The Iranian presidential election. But depending on who wins that election, chances are most candidates who are running will be seen by the administration as a better alternative to Ahmadinejad. And the argument will be we need to give the new Iranian president some time to solidify his political base, turn to negotiations, and see if we can get a deal. So we're at least going to give them another additional 3 months before we hit them with gold sanctions. I would argue another 6 months. So we are in effect going to give them 9 to 12 months worth of gold sanctions relief, worth in the neighborhood of $30 to $40 billion, that they've received without giving up any nuclear concessions. Right? They never actually agreed to any of our nuclear proposals in Almaty. We have now given the Iranians about $40 billion, $30, $40 billion worth of foreign exchange reserves in the form of gold, which effectively, depending on estimates, either increases their foreign exchange reserves by 40% or potentially doubles it. So now Mr. Khamenei, Mr. Khamenei, Mr. Supreme Leader, we have more than enough economic runway for Mr. Abbas Davani to get to nuclear breakout, to build a secret enrichment facility, to continue the development of separated plutonium activities at Iraq, and to figure out a deal with the North Koreans, in fact, all of the above. So that's where we are. And anybody tells you in the U.S. administration that we should applaud because we've taken 1 million barrels offline and that we're tying up the other 1 million or so in these local accounts, your response should be, well, that's interesting. And why are the Iranians sell 1 million barrels and get $40 billion worth of gold? That's the scenario we're facing. And that's why this report is so important. Because taking those 1 million barrels offline are not only important on the quantity side, they're important on the revenue side. They're important because the Iranians would then not be able to sell their oil and get gold in return. I'll conclude with this. This is a very timely discussion because in the next 2 weeks, the House Foreign Affairs Committee is going to be marking on the Royce Engel bill, the Iran sanctions bill. There are initiatives on the Senate side from Senators Kirk and Collins and Shaheen and others who are looking at Iran sanctions. And there's a real opportunity for you and your boss to actually take the recommendations in this report, the fact that you've got the evidence and the analytics behind you to make the case that we can take, from a quantity perspective, 1 million barrels of Iranian oil up market every day. And to make the point from a revenue perspective, if we don't do this, Iran will replenish its foreign exchange reserves, extend its economic runway, and they will have plenty of time to get to the point of nuclear breakout. And then sanctions will fail, diplomacy fail, and we'll face 2 awful options. Either a nuclear armed Iran or U.S. or Israeli military strikes to forestall that possibility. Thanks.
And we have just a shade more than 20 minutes left, so I'll forego asking many questions that have come to mind after hearing these presentations. We'll open it up. Folks here, just one fair warning. I invite you, of course, to ask as provocative a question as you can figure, but we are recording and we'll post on the FBI website. So if that affects how provocative a question you ask. Also, please ask that you state your name and affiliation before asking any questions. And Stephen, looks like you're first down the gate. So
Hi, Steve Rodriguez. I'm a managing director for an investment bank in New York, covering our defense portfolio. But had the pleasure of spending 10 years of my life here and overseas. I agree that the market's responding to sentiment, and I guess having flipped through the report quickly, I guess the big question I have is the amount of oil in the market a relevant factor here? And it seems to be heavily predicated, obviously, on taking the oil offline and denying the Iranians that revenue. But wouldn't, or let me phrase this question. Has the market already priced in that risk premium once action actually happens, or if there is change in that region, which the Iranians would certainly use to their advantage as they have in the past? Or is that something that they would use to their advantage in the future, should some of these recommendations come to fruition?
Yeah, right. So we think the market is underpricing Iran risk as the place to start off. So if demand weren't falling and supply weren't rising, all things being equal, the price would rise meaningfully, not $50, maybe $50. We think what creates the room is the fact that actually the demand curve is moving to the supply curve is moving to the right because we're adding in new supply at the bottom of the cost curve. So Iraq is at the bottom of the cost curve. Actually, lifetime oil isn't that high up. Libya is at the bottom of the cost curve. So we're pushing the cost curve to the right, which means basically that at a given quantity of supply, the clearing price is going to be lower. So it's not as though we don't need to incentivize marginal new production at the top of the cost curve, which changes the situation. And demand is remarkably low. And we think the combination of weak economic growth and fuel efficiency will push demand lower over the course of the year. Sorry. So is the market pricing this in fully? No. We think that's part of why one of the things we focus on in the recommendations here is how to communicate to the market to make it clear that there are policy options to constrain the worst scenarios, to try to ensure that when the market prices it, it doesn't price it in irrationally. We think the market has thought a lot about this. And it's interesting that if you look at prices last year, they really didn't respond at all to the actual average. Once they responded a lot to the announcement of sanctions, and then they eased back off and they didn't come back up again when the supply actually came online, because I think the analysis was actually moving towards. And I'm happy to chat more about that.
Ray Walls, President Walls Company. Essentially, we shut ran out of the Swiss system and talk about T2 system here that still is open to question. I was in Paris about 5 years ago, right off the Champs-Elysees. There's a huge Bank of Iran. what is the French cooperating with our efforts and our allies' efforts to further put clamps on Iranian international financial transactions?
Well, thanks for your question timely, because I was in Paris just last week, and I'm actually, when it comes to the Iran issue, I'm a big fan of the French. I think that the French are extremely concerned about an Iranian nuke. They have a very strong non-proliferation tradition, and I think they are one of our best partners in the world on this issue. Specifically, your question on financial transactions. The financial sanctions, the U.S. and EU financial sanctions, have done a pretty good job of restricting Iran's ability to engage in certain prohibited trade, whether it's trade relating to parts and components for the nuclear missile program, or whether it is prohibited oil transactions. They've made it more difficult for the Iranians. The SWIFT system, the SWIFT situation is very useful. Many of those banks would be SWIFted. They would throw it off the SWIFT system. It's very hard for the Iranians to use SWIFT today.
Yeah.
But oil transactions don't take place via SWIFT because it's very easy for the National Iranian Oil Company to set up a bank account at the same bank as its major refinery. So if you imagine Japan is buying Iranian oil, the National Iranian Oil Company will set up a bank account at Bank Sumitomo, and that's where the Japanese refinery has a bank account, and the transfer will take place inside the same bank. So it doesn't require SWIFT. It's an intra-bank transfer. So SWIFT is most relevant for smaller commercial transactions, and it has created some difficulties for Iran. An initiative that's being considered on the Hill right now, which all of you should be aware of, is a piece of legislation that will restrict the ability of designated Iranian entities and oil money that has been generated as a result of prohibited activities to clear through what's called the Target 2 system. It's essentially the European equivalent of FedWire. It's a euro clearing and settlement mechanism that would allow Iran to use euros that are sitting in Chinese banks today, get hold of those euros, convert those euros to Chinese yuan, or to repatriate those euros back to Iran. That has to clear through Europe. It has to do a U-turn through a European financial institution. There's an initiative to shut that down. So financial sanctions are definitely making it more difficult for the Iranians to operate, but they are finding loopholes all over the place. And I mentioned a major loophole, which was gold. Right? That's not a financial transaction. Those are gold bars literally being packed in suitcases, flown to Dubai, and either sent directly to Iran or a stop off for coffee at a Dubai-based money exchanger, currency trader, and swapping that gold into dollars or euros. The Iranians now have been able to take oil and convert it into hard currency. And that's a major loophole in the financial sanctions regime, and the U.S. Treasury Department and the Europeans have done a very good job in putting in place.
Jason F. with European Command. Is there any sanction that, and this is probably for other people, any actual sanction that you think would really stop the nuclear program? With the recent, North Korea aspects, and this is a juvenile repressed talking more state actor, and they gain the world's attention with their nuclear capability, and they have a $40 billion GDP, and they demand the entire world's focus. With that idea, is there anything that could possibly be, and I'm not trying to be pro-attack, but is there any sanction or any monetary policy that could possibly be in place that would really stop the idea that they want a nuclear weapon so much that they would just do it on tax and people transfer all their business spending just to get this long system?
Well, I think John and I can both address this. Look, I think I always think of this the way I sort of outlined it, which is, in economic terms, Iran is facing a what economists call a balance of payments crisis. And that balance of payments crisis is a result of the fact that on the current account side, oil revenues have been dropping. And most importantly, on the capital account, there are large outflows of capital leaving Iran as Iranians look for safe haven for their money, and very small capital inflows as investment in Iran's energy sector and elsewhere dries up. So there's a balance of payments crisis. Their principal weapon against economic collapse is their foreign exchange reserve account, right? The cash in the bank that they can use to offset that balance of payments crisis. So then the question is, well, how much money have they got in the bank? How far are they depleting those foreign exchange reserves? And when is their notional economic cripple date? When do they start to see the red line on foreign exchange reserves so that when Mr. Khamenei has that meeting with the central banker, he's head of his nuclear program, the news is really, really bad. The news is, Mr. Khamenei, we are facing economic meltdown. And I think the argument that we have made over the years, we're making on this panel, is the Iranians are nowhere near economic meltdown. They're still selling 1 million barrels of oil. They're getting gold in return. They have large foreign exchange reserves. And so what sanction would work? There's no silver bullet sanction, but one of the biggest things we could do is affect the balance of payments crisis by taking the 1 million barrels of oil that they sell every day offline, which represents 80% of their export earnings, 50 to 60% of their government budget. So that would bring them to the brink of economic collapse. And then we would test your thesis. We would test your thesis and we would see whether that was enough to break the nuclear will of Mr. Khamenei, or whether he is prepared to let his people, I guess in the famous words, who was it, of Pakistani President Zia, who said, my people will eat grass so that we can get a nuke. We don't know, we haven't tested that proposition. I think what we're all arguing is we're not going to get a nuclear deal with Iran that addresses the military element of Iran's nuclear program unless we bring the Iranians to the brink of economic collapse and test the thesis. And we're not there yet, and we're running desperately out of time.
Yeah, I agree with everything Mark has said. My bottom line is that I'm doubtful for all the reasons that you say. I think this is something that the regime sees as absolutely critical to its long-term ambitions, to regime survival, to regime success, and what exactly is going to stop them from going all the way and making whatever sacrifice they need to make to achieve that. It's very hard to say, other than a very credible threat in the here and now that if they don't compromise on that program, they have a 100% guarantee that their regime survival will be put at risk. Can any particular group of economic sanctions do that? I don't know. I mean, the fact is, though, that we need a comprehensive strategy. And I think that's what we're trying to do. Economic sanctions and making them as hard as we can and to put this regime's economic survival at least at risk is, I think, central to that. It does include an important negotiations plank and a very reasonable compromise solution that helps the Iranians save face and back away from this nuclear weapons program. But it also, it has to be said, includes guys like you putting a very, very credible threat of force on the table so that the Iranians know that there is no way in hell, no matter how close they get, they're ever going to have their hands on a nuclear bomb. Because we just simply won't allow it. So give up now, reach some kind of acceptable compromise, and let's have something that begins to look like a win-win situation. So I think the which we haven't mentioned, this military component to the strategy, is absolutely essential, and it's the paradox of any kind of coercive diplomacy strategy. In order to get somebody to do something peacefully, you've got to be willing to really credibly make them believe that you're prepared to go to war. And I think we have to do that, and we have to look very hard with whether we're doing everything on that military component to make it possible. Finally, I would just say that if we are going to have a chance with these sanctions, it does seem to me that the entire history of the Iranian regime's decision-making is that unless unless they are faced with this kind of choice between going their preferred route or the possible destruction of that regime, they're going to go with their preferred objectives and goals. We've got, to the extent we have any history during the Iran-Iraq War, the only thing that made the Supreme Leader at that time, Khomeini, the founder of the regime, what he said, drink this, what was it, drink the chalice? Poison chalice, was when he really had a fear that continuing the war would in fact endanger the survival of the regime, and was told that specifically by some of his most important commanders. The second time was when they took a dramatic step in suspending their nuclear program in 2003, immediately after our successful invasion of Iraq, and when we had 150,000 forces in place threatening them on their borders, and they clearly didn't want to be there. So they took a dramatic move regarding their nuclear program. So I think whether it can work or not, if we want to give this policy of peacefully resolving this crisis every opportunity that we can to work, and I think that's all of our obligations, whether we believe it will work or not. I think this, pursuing this sanctions strategy to its end and to its logical conclusion by taking some of the steps that Mark and Paul have talked about to really make these crippling and to advance the date in which the Iranian regime has to face a true foreign currency crisis. That we've got to get on that, and we've got to get on it now, because time is very short. This notion of waiting until the Iranian elections and seeing if there's possibly a good outcome and giving away another 3 or 4 months when we may not have much longer than a year till the date when the Iranians achieve that critical capability on their nuclear